tonight, I'm going to share a couple of my stinky fish with you tonight. A stinky fish is a metaphor for that thing that you carry around but don't like to talk about. But the longer you hide it, the stinkier it gets. Then we'll get practical and observe a listening exercise as some ladies discuss one of their stinky fish. Finally, we'll make it personal and relate it to the stinky fish in your life. Don't worry, you won't be asked to share anything you don't feel comfortable with. The theme for International Women's Day this year is Choose to Challenge. I came across a quote by the author Adam Grant last week, which I thought was perfect for this theme and ties in with what I want to share with you tonight. Vulnerability is not the opposite of resilience. Vulnerability builds resilience. Projecting perfection protects your ego, but shuts people out and stunts your growth. Revealing struggles shows humility and humanity, opening the door to new sources of support and strength. When I first planned this masterclass, I thought I was just going to talk about the challenge of airing stinky fish. However, I realized that the real challenge, the thing that can really bring change, is admitting to yourself that you not only have a stinky fish, but taking a deep breath, diving down and finding the root cause of the stink that's permeating your life, but which you've become a master at covering up. So the real challenge is twofold. Airing your stinky fish, which starts with admitting to yourself you have one, and then defining or identifying the root cause of the stink. Only then will your stinky fish become less stinky. Okay, so let's talk about my stinky fish. I'm a strong, independent Kiwi woman, an organizer and planner. I can do anything I set my mind to. And that's how I approached caring for my stubborn bugger of a husband, the one and only Matthew Chadwick. You see, Matt was living with a brain tumor. I married him knowing he was living with a brain tumor, but nothing really prepares you for the reality of when it starts to affect your relationship and your role starts to change from wife to carer. I wanted people to believe I was coping. However, the realization that I would soon lose my husband, become a young widow, and have to continue life without Matt by my side was emotionally overwhelming. I did what I do best. I tried to put control back in my life, to manage my stinky fish. I was adamant that if I didn't admit I had a stinky fish, that I could keep everything under control. The stronger my denial, the more I threw myself into running marathons, work, and fundraising. Despite my desperate attempts to manage my stinky fish and hide the smell, the stinkier it became. Driving to work, I'd been in floods of tears with no idea why I was crying. At work, I was focused, but also very prickly, and people started avoiding me. I was crumbling. I couldn't understand it. The only thing I was succeeding at was failing at everything. And so the stinky fish of not being able to cope turned into the stinky fish of feeling guilty that I wasn't looking after Matt properly, that I wasn't looking after myself properly, that I was neglecting friends and family and wasn't performing to my full potential at work. Eventually, my fish got so stinky that I couldn't bear the smell anymore, and I went to see my GP. GPs must see a lot of people carrying their stinky fish. Turned out I needed help. I couldn't do it alone. At first, I felt like even more of a failure. No longer was I a strong, independent Kiwi woman. I was someone who needed help. Worse still, that help was counselling, which to me meant the problem lay with me. However, when I stopped crying and my head stopped worrying so much, I found I had the energy to be the carer I wanted to be for Matt. The best part was my counsellor helped me put things in perspective and work out ways to make life better when everything seemed out of control. Life didn't become perfect, it was far from it. But by admitting I had a stinky fish, that I needed help to cope with the reality of becoming a young widow, my stinky fish was aired Now that I'd admitted to myself that I had a stinky fish, I had to get to the root cause of it so it could become less stinky. Finding the root cause of the stinky fish was much tougher than airing it, and I carried it with me for a long time after Matt passed. It wasn't until I admitted that the cause of the stink was the guilt I felt at building an emotional wall to try and manage the grieving process that the stink dissipated. Airing my stinky fish, admitting I had one, was the first step in tackling my challenge, but it wasn't until I was able to understand the root cause of the smell that I was able to rid myself of that stinky fish. I hate to think what would have happened if I'd have stayed in denial about my stinky fish, kept patching over it with marathons, work, and fundraising. I'm pretty sure I would have had a breakdown. Stinky fish are stinky because they're complicated with no obvious solution. If I'd continued to try and manage my stinky fish, I'd have had to sustain this for over 2 years. That's a long time to mask the smell of a stinky fish that's only getting stinkier. Sadly, you can't predict or manage a stinky fish. Only by admitting you have one and finding the root cause can you rid yourself of it. I battled with my next stinky fish, determined not to admit it or air it for a good year. Stinky fish number 2 was adapting to living with incurable cancer. To look at me, you'd think I was a middle-aged woman with a tendency to overindulge. You'd be right. However, appearances can also be deceptive. I am a middle-aged woman with a tendency to overindulge, but I'm also a widow living with incurable cancer who has a terrifying online shopping addiction. You see, living with incurable cancer, my life has changed, but not by my choice. After chemotherapy, surgery, and radiotherapy, I was desperate for normality. I returned to full-time work, filled my diary with social engagements, and booked holidays abroad. I had a lot of living to do. Yet the more I tried to hide my stinky fish with the trappings of normality, the tireder and more frustrated I became. Once again, I found myself at breaking point, overwhelmed and out of control. How could I plan when I was living with so much uncertainty? How could I find the energy to do the things I wanted to do? I reached out to my breast care nurse and explained my situation, hoping for a quick fix. Once again, my stinky fish had been slapping me around the face, and yet I'd blindly chosen to ignore it. You guessed it, my breast care nurse referred me for counselling. If only I'd learned to ask for help sooner. With the help of my counsellor, I was able to accept that while my mind may be willing, physically, my body can no longer deliver. I was able to grieve for the life I'd planned and come to terms with a more refined, some might say, mature life. As someone who is constantly active and on a career trajectory, it was difficult to admit this was no longer my destiny. But admitting my life had changed wasn't the stinky part. The cause of the stink was not knowing who I was now. It felt like I'd lost my identity, and with it, my self-confidence. Accepting these new limitations meant I had to redefine who I was. If I accepted these new limitations, was I giving in? Was I selling myself short? Was I letting myself be defined by cancer? I'm still working towards getting rid of this stinky fish, but now that I've admitted and accepted that my life has changed, it's not quite so stinky. Since accepting my life has changed and that some things just can't be controlled, I no longer feel a sense of panic that I'm missing out. I'm making informed decisions, choices based on my new limitations, rather than saying yes to everything, knowing full well I'll have to cancel and frustrate myself and friends and family in doing so. I still have to summon the courage to introduce myself to new people, to be Chris, the strong, independent Kiwi woman, fearless internet shopper and global traveler. It's a matter of fake it till you make it at the moment, but each time I meet new people without shriveling into my shell, the smell gets a little less stinkier. COVID has thrown us all into a period of uncertainty. For some of us, this has meant our stinky fish have become even stinkier. Living in confined spaces, heightened emotions, and the financial impact of COVID, it's not been an easy year for any of us. Many of us have stinky fish that keep us up at night, and we can continue to let them keep us up at night, or we can choose to air them and start to make a change. Don't be like me and live in denial, trying to keep them hidden or thinking you can find ways to manage them. Whatever your challenges, your stinky fish, don't let them fester. It really does just make them stinkier and even more unruly. But if you're serious about tackling your stinky fish, it means you have to become vulnerable. You have to be less than perfect. You have to show humility and humanity and ask for help. We have an amazing network that Bronwyn has set up for us. Kiwi women are incredibly resilient and resourceful. I challenge you to make use of the network, to reach out for help and support when you need it. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. However, that means you have to ask for help, which really isn't easy. It's not in my nature and it probably isn't yours. But ask yourself this: if you knew someone was struggling with a stinky fish and didn't ask for help, what would your response be? You'd scoff and call them a silly bugger, wouldn't you? Don't let that person be you. It's okay to ask for help. In fact, I challenge you to ask for help, whatever it might be. After all, what's the alternative? If we continue to hide our stinky fish, how can we bring about change? How can we hold ourselves up as strong, independent Kiwi women, role models for the future generation? I'd like to remind you of Adam Grant's quote from earlier. Vulnerability is not the opposite of resilience. Vulnerability builds resilience. Projecting perfection protects your ego, but shuts people out and stunts your growth. Revealing struggles shows humility and humanity, opening the door to new sources of support and strength. From challenge comes change. So ladies, let's all choose to challenge. And here's my challenge for you right now. What's keeping you up at night? What are your stinky fish? The really stinky fish are pretty stinky. There's a reason you don't want to talk about them and want to keep them hidden. That's okay, you don't have to share them. Just take a few minutes to write them down now on a piece of paper or make a note on your phone.